All right, good morning. Morning. Okay, so kind of kick things off. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of quick wins with hybrid identity, as Microsoft calls it. So a little bit of both some on-premises things, because of course we've all got that, despite what the marketing and sales folks might lead you to believe, and then a little bit around some things with Azure AD. Question I have for the room: how many people have Azure AD Premium or EMS, the Enterprise Mobility Suite? So maybe 40% or so. Okay. So we'll kind of adjust this as we go based on that. Just a kind of quick intro. So my name is Brian Desmond. I am a principal at a consulting organization called Ravenswood Technology Group, and we spend most of our time actually deploying the stuff I'm going to talk about. So a little bit of real world experience and expertise there. My contact info is on the screen there as well. Feel free to reach out afterwards if you've got questions. I'm always happy to hear from you. And social media, if you do that, is there as well. And I'll be hanging around the rest of the day, and would love to talk to you afterwards if you have any follow-up questions. So all that said, where I usually start with this is everything still starts with on-premises infrastructure. I would imagine probably everybody in the room has Active Directory. They're using that as the source of truth for identities for many systems, if not all the systems that you have. And certainly with Azure AD and Office 365, all that starts with Active Directory. So if that house isn't in order, whatever you do in the cloud is also going to kind of bring some of that disorder, some of that chaos along with it. So it's super important that we secure on-premises infrastructure, that we treat that. We run that at the highest level of assurance that we can. And of course, because if something happens to AD, something's going to happen to Azure AD as well. So a lot of times we talk about things like putting tiered infrastructure controls in place, protecting domain admin accounts, using things like privileged access workstations to manage AD. All of those controls trickle downstream to Azure AD, to the cloud. So they're super important. But at the same time, your organization's made investments with Microsoft. They've made investments with other vendors. If you take those investments and you continue paying for them, but you don't actually take advantage of them, there's obviously a bit of loss in value there. So how can we figure out how to make sure that we've secured the infrastructure that we have, and that it's certainly clean to a degree, but we're also not blocking using the new investments we've made for an extended period of time, which is something that I see a lot of organizations do. They go to take advantage of all this new stuff, and then they realize that, well, gee, we've got a 1 or 2 or 3 year cleanup project that we didn't quite realize, and it doesn't look real good on the books when you take that cost, what you're paying to Microsoft, you're paying to another vendor, you keep paying that for years at a time, but don't actually take advantage of it. So there's a balance to be had of how do I make sure that my house is in order, but at the same time start taking advantage of what I have. And as we go through this, kind of the way I look at the things that are in this deck, in this discussion, is what are things that I can start using incrementally without having to get everything to a certain place before I use anything at all. And so getting these quick wins, the most important thing is generating momentum. Once you get momentum with that initial win, that initial thing that you get your organization to buy into, that's going to create everything that you need to start building a foundation, creating value, and taking advantage of some of the things that are a little harder, might take a little bit more effort to actually start consuming. So we've got the things I've got in here are really, for the most part, kind of arranged, at least in my mind, of easier or less effort to more effort. That's going to vary a little bit by organization to organization, but certainly the thought being that if we can get some quick wins, we'll start with some of the easy stuff. So the first one's one that's been around for forever, but is one of the features in Azure AD that when we deploy this for customers, there's just a really fast uptake and some really measurable cost benefit on this, and that's around self-service password reset. Like I said, it's something we've been talking about for a really long time. Lots of companies have been making a lot of money selling tools to solve for that. We have a number of large enterprise customers that did the entire business case to make an EMS purchase, to make an Azure AD purchase solely on self-service password reset. And so if you haven't used this, it allows you to use your phone, text message, or more recently the Microsoft Authenticator app to be able to reset your password. This whole experience is hosted in the cloud, but in real time it will write that password back to your on-premises AD, and it will honor your on-premises password policies. So while it's a fully cloud-hosted service, it interlocks with what is probably the source of truth for passwords in your organization, or one of them, which is your on-premises AD. And then there are also the ability to put a forgot my password link on the Control-Alt-Delete screen, not only for Windows 10 devices, but Windows 7 and 8.1 devices as well. So it's like I said, it's cloud hosted, but it's not something that only works with cloud identity. The key thing with self-service password reset deployments is you've got to force people to change behaviors. They can't keep calling the help desk because that defeats the point of having this self-service tool in place. So what do you do to actually force that change? And that takes time. And the other part of it is making sure people are actually enrolled. If they haven't enrolled, they haven't set up their details to use self-service password reset. Of course, the next time they've forgotten their password, you have a bit of a chicken and an egg problem that they can't use the tool. So getting people forced through that so that when it is time to use it, they're set up to do that. And there's a control specifically in Azure AD that can force people to enroll for self-service password reset the next time they access any application that's integrated with Azure AD. So that could be an Office 365 workload, that could be a SaaS application that you're using, that could even be a line of business app that you have integrated with Azure AD. And then there used to be, and for most organizations there still is, this problem that if you use Microsoft's two-factor or MFA solution, you had to enroll for that, and you had to enroll for self-service password reset, and yet the details were seemingly exactly the same. There is a feature that is in preview that you can turn on in your tenant. We turn it on for most of our customers that does what Microsoft calls converging that registration experience. So now once you've registered for MFA, you're also registered for self-service password reset and vice versa. Once that's turned on, you also get the ability to use their mobile authenticator app for self-service password reset. Previously, you could only use phone call, email address, alternate email address, or security questions for self-service password reset. But once that converged experience is turned on, you can also use the mobile app, the authenticator app, which for many people is a kind of much smoother experience. This is, especially if you have organizations where you have kind of frontline workers, people that are maybe working in a manufacturing environment, they're working in retail, those sorts of things. Many times we see organizations where they really are underserved by IT, and this becomes actually a way to bootstrap IT services for all those people. If you can pre-register them or just have them go through a registration experience rather than having potentially tens of thousands of help desk calls or a prolonged experience, you can use this to get all these people onboarded and have access to things like HR self-service, time tracking, line of business applications, and so forth. One of the organizations we did this with was a retail customer, and they, over the course of about a month, maybe a little bit less, onboarded over 80,000 people into self-service password reset. Previously, none of those people actually had IT services. They had a need for a HR rollout to be able to have people start tracking things like vacation, get their W-2 at the end of the year, that sort of thing. We got them all through a self-service password reset registration, and in turn being able to set their password. And if you looked at that, the enrollment graph kind of went like this, and there's this hockey stick that went straight up over a really short period of time. So this is, it'll tell you, is super doable. There's a bit of organizational change management, but ultimately the ROI on this can be really big. So then now you have people that can sign in. The next thing that tends to be really low-hanging fruit is actually delivering single sign-on to applications. For some organizations, this can be a little bit simpler in the form of we have all these different passwords that people have to all these different systems. How do we bring that together? For others, that can be we have another federation platform that we're paying for. We've got overlap. How can we get off that? Sometimes it's a mix of all those. But fundamentally, typically when we do these projects, we look at these long lists of applications. Sometimes for a small organization that's 5 or 10, it's a really manageable number. Sometimes it's 100. Sometimes it's thousands of applications. The trick typically with this is how do we get some momentum? And that typically is a couple different buckets of app. One is high volume applications. If you have something that everybody uses all the time, an intranet, a Workday or a SuccessFactors, an HR platform, a ServiceNow or another ticketing solution, getting those done first gets everybody using the solution and proves that yes, this really does work and really creates the foundation for getting the rest of things moving. And then the other ones is sometimes they're super low volume apps. They're really high risk. If someone has access to this, what information, what data, what could happen if we don't control access to that? And so getting those onboarded as well gives you the ability to put controls on that. And we'll talk about that in a couple minutes. But typically those high volume apps and those high risk apps are the ones that we start with, and they really prove that the solution will work and gives you the foundation to start moving through the entire catalog of different applications. One tool that I will call it, how many people have used a tool called Fiddler before? It's maybe half the room. So if you haven't used Fiddler, this is something I would encourage you. It's a free tool, www.getfiddler.com. It's an HTTP proxy that runs on your machine. Now, any website that you go to, you see everything that's happening. It decrypts all the SSL traffic, which means when you're doing things like setting up SAML SSO or OAuth or something like that, you can actually see the actual tokens, the actual requests that are getting generated. This takes the whole process of setting up single sign-on in particular from very opaque to seeing exactly what's going on so you can solve the problem and solve it quickly. It's also great for just in general troubleshooting pretty much any solution that is web-based, whether it's browser-based or even a thick client. So I'd encourage you to check that out. So privileged access. How many people have had problems with, we got this thing called Azure AD or Office 365, and suddenly we had dozens or hundreds of people that were in roles like global admins or Skype admins, Exchange admins, maybe a few. This is kind of the same problem that if you run on-premises AD, there was this cycle that hopefully most organizations went through where we had way too many people in these groups like domain admins. And we discovered that was really bad because they could do a lot of really bad things with it. But now we need to take that away. And of course, taking things away is really hard. So Azure AD has a feature called Privileged Identity Management. It is all about kind of what the name says, putting both governance and security on privileged and high-risk roles. What it does is it converts that from permanent access to just-in-time access. So rather than simply signing in, and now I'm in a role like global admins, I'm in a role like Exchange admins, I'm now just myself. I can go to privileged identity management. I can pick one of the roles that I've been marked as eligible for, and I can elevate into it for a period of time. So maybe we set a policy that says you can be a global admin if you're eligible for it for a period of 4 hours. I'll be forced through a multi-factor auth process, then I get added to that role. 4 hours later, I automatically drop out of it. So now we only have people in roles when they actually need it. But the other thing we get is this great audit trail of when people are actually using this data, or using these roles, I'm sorry. With this audit trail, now you can come back after 3 months or 6 months, and of all those people that are in these roles, you can prove who actually needs it, because clearly if they need it, they're using it, and the audit trails show that information, and you can use that to start cleaning up access. There's also built-in access certifications where either someone's manager, an owner, or the person themselves on a recurring basis will get forced to actually re-up their access. If they don't re-up their access, that automatically gets pulled out from under them at the end of the access review or access certification cycle. That also creates audit data that you can provide to auditors who need to see who has access and who's approved it and so forth. The one footnote with PIM, or Privileged Identity Management, it requires Azure AD Premium P2, which a lot of organizations don't have, but it only requires it for the administrators that are covered by this. So whether you have a couple dozen, a couple hundred people that have access to privileged Azure AD roles, or even Azure resources, you can license it just for those people, which typically is a pretty low cost, and start taking advantage of this just for those folks, as opposed to having to license it for the entire organization. I know it's early. Questions on any of this? Feel free to jump in if you do have any, and I'm happy to take this in whatever direction.
Covered admins?
What do you mean by covered admins? So anyone that's going to use PIM to elevate into a role would need to be licensed by this.
Do you have to be at P1, Premium 1 to use that feature as well?
Do you have?
Can you be at Azure Office 365 and just buy P2 for those?
Good question. Do I have to have the base AAD P1 just to even buy P2? So P2 is an additive, or it's a whole SKU, so you could buy this just for those people and not license anyone else. Yep.
Do you have any thoughts on how organizations should be moving if they are already invested in some of the on-prem PIM solutions like CyberArk or BeyondTrust versus Azure? Just keep Azure for the cloud resources and use those products for on-prem resources. Have you seen kind of how they balance that?
Yeah, so the question was, what if I have an existing privileged access management solution, a CyberArk or BeyondTrust, something like that? Should I take advantage of this? Should I use the capabilities that are in one of the on-prem PAM solutions? Everybody's kind of got an opinion on this. My typical take on the CyberArks, the BeyondTrust, the ERPMs, all these tools, is that they typically have access to every single system in your organization implicitly because they have credentials for that. And almost every organization that I go to runs those out of a team that shouldn't have any of that access. So they have a generic server organization or a Wintel support team or something like that who implicitly has the keys to everything. And we say, well, all of my domain admin credentials are super secure because I put them in this box that only they can get to, and these 100 people over there. So that is often a difficult conversation about the reality of what we've done, where we've taken all these things that only these people had access, and now all these people have access. So my challenge to you would be, if you have that problem, do you want to put more keys in the box that all these people can get to, and potentially put those at risk to an adversary, because that PAM solution becomes the biggest target in your organization. Because if I can get that, I can probably get anything.
One item with privileged identity management, I'm just curious if there's been any other conversations anyone has had as they've integrated this. Is one item that we identified quickly is that even though your admins need to be trusted, right? You trust your admins. That's one thing that you have to take into consideration. But one nuance with this is we identified the concern around how important the privileged identity management role becomes within Azure AD due to self-approvals and other workflow options there. So has there been any conversation about how to control now the group of privileged identity management role holders? Has there been any discussion about proper management
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there is a role within PIM called privileged security admins, privileged identity admins. I forget the exact name, but those are the people that can actually manage who has access. So of course, if I have that, I can give anyone or myself access. There are also a set of controls in PIM where not only do you have to do MFA to elevate into a role, but you might need to get approval from another listed person. So for the role that actually gives you the ability to change who has access, sometimes what we will do is say that not only do you have to do MFA, but you have to get approval from one or two other people that are allowed to do this. And they sign in and they click approve. They get a little email notification that says they have to do this. So now you have basically a peer saying that, yes, that's really someone that needs this access. Someone isn't doing that maliciously or something like that. So another feature that doesn't get talked about a lot, this is actually one of my favorite kind of hidden features in Azure AD, is something called the Azure Application Proxy. And what this is a cloud-native reverse proxy where you run what are called app proxy connectors. There's a small little agent that runs on a server on-prem. They make a pool of outbound connections to Azure AD, so there's no holes coming in through the firewall, and they use those connections to listen for requests. And you go in Azure AD and you configure it to publish certain applications. This typically works with traditional on-prem applications that do Windows integrated authentication, so Kerberos in particular. It also works with applications that run behind the firewall that use SAML or WSFed or other federation protocols. You configure Azure AD to publish one of these apps. You change the DNS record to point to a URL that Azure AD gives you, so the user doesn't have to learn a new way to get to one of these applications. Now when they go to that URL, first they come to Azure AD, they have to authenticate, they have to pass through any security checks that you've defined through something called conditional access, which we'll talk about in a minute. Once they pass through all those checks, that request goes back through that tunnel. So they meet in the middle in the cloud, it gets proxied to the on-prem application, and then the response gets returned to the user. So the cool thing here is we've got no inbound holes in the firewall. Before the user can even get to the application, they have to pass through all the checks that we've defined in Azure AD. So from a security perspective, we're filtering all that. And it also typically removes the need for things like VPNs, because now I can take the typical tests that were done with a VPN. Maybe they're coming from a managed device, they've done multi-factor authentication and so forth. I can put those on the login attempt. And before the user can even get to the app, they pass through all those tests. These app proxy connectors are super scalable. Typically, one of them can handle about 1,000 requests per second. You can have different pools of them if you have apps that some might be in the US, some might be overseas in Europe or Asia, for example. You can align different apps to different connectors. And you can start publishing these apps. You know, customers we have that are very successful with this, some of them have hundreds or even thousands of apps that are published through the app proxy, as opposed to having people have to connect to a VPN to get to something that typically they would have done so before. And so what I kind of alluded to is this idea of putting controls on access to these applications. So there's a feature in Azure AD, which is by far the Microsoft's fastest growing capability in Azure AD, called conditional access. And what conditional access lets me do is define policy for every time someone wants to access an application, whether that's a Microsoft native workload like Office 365, whether that's a SaaS application that you've federated with Azure AD, maybe a Salesforce or a ServiceNow, a line of business app that developers created, or something that's published with the application proxy. And now what I can do is I can take that, and for a given app, or maybe for all my applications, maybe for a set of them, I can require things like MFA. I can require that user to be coming from a known device. And if we're using Intune, I can not only say, is that a known device, but is it compliant with our policies? I can make decisions about Microsoft's risk scoring of that sign-in. Is that a low, high, or medium risk sign-in? And make a decision. Maybe it's a high risk sign-in and a high risk application. I'm not even going to allow allow access to it at all, but maybe it's a medium risk sign-in for another set of applications as long as they're using MFA or they're coming from a known device. I don't need to worry. I can let them through. We can also key off things like the location the user is coming from as well. And all that goes into these conditional access policies and gates who has access to what applications, when they have access, and how they get that access. Joe Kaplan, who's sitting in the back, has an entire, I think he's got a 45-minute slot later today about this, so I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this, but suffice it to say, this is one of those things that you can greatly change how people access applications and data in your organization with not a whole lot of actual efforts. This is all built in and is cloud native, and it'll also handle on-premises apps. How many people do not have password hash synchronization enabled in their organization? Do not. All right. So you should enable that. Even if you're using pass-through auth, you're federating with ADFS, with ping, with another federation provider. Password hash sync will work just fine in the background. It doesn't actually take the actual passwords and put them in Azure AD. That's the typical misconception. It actually takes the password hashes, the one-way hashes that are stored in your AD, and it rehashes them about 1,000 times, and then takes that iteratively rehashed value and sends that to Azure AD. Your federation will continue to work just the way it always has. If something ever happened with that federation provider, you have a free DR plan. You could fail over to password hash sync with not a whole lot of effort. But you also get this, if you have Azure AD Premium, this report that many people don't know about, and it's the top line item in the little screenshot, and it's called Users with Leaked Credentials. And what Microsoft does is they're actually purchasing or obtaining, we'll call it, these lists of leaked credentials that make it onto the internet from some of the various attacks and credential dumps that you read about in the news. They get those lists, they take them all, they run them through the same hashing algorithm that Azure AD Connect and your on-premises AD does. They run that entire list against all the credentials that are stored in Azure AD, and now they let you know if you have a user in your organization whose username and password has been leaked on one of these lists, so you can take action. That can be a manual action. This generates email alerts. You could have your service desk or security organization respond to this. There are controls we'll talk about in a minute. You can actually automate this with Azure AD, where if you have self-service password reset enabled, you have the users with leaked credentials report enabled, you can actually automatically have Azure AD force that user to do two-factor authentication next time they sign in and reset their password on the spot. So now they no longer have a password that's on one of these lists. So to me, this is super valuable, but the only way you get this is if you have password hash synchronization enabled. So one of my messages to pretty much every customer I go to is you have to get this turned on so you can take advantage of this and get the value from this.
What do you tell compliance people that this freaks them out?
What do you tell compliance people that this freaks them out? I always start with, well, what are the risks you're concerned about, and let's talk about quantifying those risks and whether they actually are risks. My experience is that typically it's just one of those like I don't know, so my reaction is to say no rather than let's sit down and understand the problem. But I think the most important thing at the end of the day is that the password isn't reversible, and mathematically to get from where it is in the format that it's stored in Azure AD to a value that could be used on-prem is really hard. And of course, you'd also have to first compromise Azure AD and then be able to get that value. So another hidden one. So for a long time, if you use the self-service password reset feature and you put a really bad password in there, it would say something like, oops, I'm sorry, we've already seen that password again. Or we've already seen that password before. And it turns out that people pick really bad passwords pretty much as a rule these days, and a lot of that is a function of on-prem password policies that have been around for decades at this point. And it turns out that if you make people change their password about every 90 days, and you need some uppercase letters, you need some numbers, maybe you need an exclamation point or something in there, and my password expired sometime in like April or May, turns out that spring 2019 exclamation point is a really popular password. And then 90 days later, it expires at the end of August, early September. Turns out that fall 2019 exclamation point, @, whatever, however many characters it needs to be, is really popular. And then come end of January, passwords expire, and everybody in Boston sets theirs to Patriots 2020 because they've won the Super Bowl again. And it also turns out that I didn't think of all this myself, and all the bad guys that are out there doing what are called password spray attacks have figured this out as well. So what they do is, rather than trying to brute force a password and run through thousands or hundreds of thousands of combinations, they come up with these values that lots of people statistically pick, and they go hit every username pair just once in your organization, and chances are they'll get a small percentage of them, they'll get a hit. And that's really hard to track from a report because that doesn't lock accounts out. It doesn't show up as something like a denial of service or something like that. It's just one bad login for every single user. Maybe there's one bad login every couple days over the period of a month. Based on these lists, based on percentages of hits, they do pretty well for themselves. And a lot of that comes from these password policies, comes from making people change them regularly and enforcing kind of artificial requirements on those passwords. So there's, of course, we could say, well, we're going to get rid of the password policy. That's a really hard lift to the question about, well, that makes compliance people freak out. So what Microsoft started doing is they identify a certain number, they don't disclose about how many, but of passwords that they see all the time in these password spray attacks that they know the bad guys are using against them. And with the cloud self-service password reset, they would match on those values, and they wouldn't let people set those, which was great as long as all your users were going through self-service password reset in the cloud. As soon as they got that your password is expired prompt on-prem, they press Control-Delete and they hit change password, all that got bypassed. And so towards the beginning of this year, there was a feature called Azure AD Password Protection that came out. And what this does is it extends that same set of controls around some of these really bad passwords and lets you enforce them on-prem in your Active Directory, in your domain controllers. So now no matter where someone resets their password, they get these same protections, they get these same bad passwords get blocked. So there's a list that gets pulled down on a regular basis that has what Microsoft thinks are some of the worst, and then you have the ability to also put in certain keywords that you want to block. So your organization, your headquarters is on a specific street, name your company, those sorts of things that people will just use because they're very memorable. You put those on the list. Now, not only does summer 2019 get blocked, but also the name of your company, the name of the street you're on, whatever values you put in there. Happy to take questions on this one. Otherwise, I will leave this here because I think Sean has a longer discussion on this later today. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. So is it agent based on the DCs? It is. So there's a small agent that goes on the domain controller. It installs what's called a password filter, which is an entry point in AD that allows it to intercept passwords when they're being changed. It sees it in clear text, and it's able to take action and return essentially true or false as to whether that password is allowed. Yeah.
You mentioned policy and alignment with password protection and SSPR. In this combination, are you engaging with any clients or does anybody else have experience with people actually starting to buy in to even some NIST framework references that says password policy is of the old ages, just focus on complexity and banned passwords? Is anybody actually really transitioning to that model?
Yeah, so the question was, are people transitioning to things like NIST, like 800.171 recommendations around maybe that password policy of 10 characters and it expires every 90 days and so forth isn't scalable anymore? And I think for customers we have which are actually subject to 171 or to 53 audits, they're very much looking at that because they're being forced to. I think many others, this is still one of those ideas that's a little new. Yeah.
So across enterprises that you've worked with, are you still finding legacy password practice in play? Predominantly, you've seen much shift towards more modern.
Yes, the question was like across our customer base, are we seeing people think about this differently? And I think the short answer is no. All right. So MFA on-prem. So how many people have RSA tokens, semantic VIP, SafeNet tokens? What other ones did I forget? Gotta have a few. What's that? Gemalto tokens. Any sort of like OTP code generator. Maybe it goes on your keychain. You've got like 6 of them. These things are they're super annoying for end users. They're super expensive as well, especially like the hard tokens. If you still have those, like conveniently the battery dies on a specific date, and then you've got to buy more of them, which is great if you sell tokens. The Azure MFA solution also has a little known plugin for the Windows Radius service, which enables the Windows Radius service to challenge people for MFA. So if you have everybody enrolled for SSPR and you have converged registration turned on, that means you also have them enrolled for MFA. Or if you just have them enrolled for Azure MFA, you can start pointing things like VPN gateways, Citrix NetScalers, VDI solutions, other things that speak Radius. You can point them at NPS or Network Policy Server, which is the role that's built into Windows that does Radius. All these devices, Radius is mostly what they do. You can repoint them to NPS. You have this plugin installed. It will start challenging the user for their primary form of MFA as they've defined it when they go to sign in. So now you can take these legacy on-prem systems that are probably going nowhere anytime soon, and you can start using the cloud-based MFA solution for them without a whole lot of reconfiguration or potentially end user change. For VPN solutions, this used to be what we did almost every single time, although most of the major VPN vendors now also support SAML-auth in their actual VPN clients, which is new. And if you ask anyone that manages these, they've probably been setting them up with Radius for decades now. So when you suggest this new idea, this is probably not something that they will bring to you. But the end user experience is dramatically better if you look at actually federating the VPN solution, whether it's with Azure AD or whatever federation platform you use. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, the way it works with Radius is you put your username and password in, and then typically the login prompt just kind of hangs there until your phone rings or you get that push notification, you say okay, and then magically the login prompt unblocks. There's typically no cue to the user that this is actually what's happening. It's just something they need to know. And then 2, they have to already be enrolled. So that whole experience where you sign in and then you proof up, you enroll your phone, you reset your password, whatever other prompts Azure AD gives you, Radius has no concept of this. It's very much a true-false type service. When you federate things like VPN gateways, they have a little browser window that pops up in the clients, whether it's like a Cisco AnyConnect or Palo Alto Global Protect. Juniper does this as well, I believe. It actually pops that browser experience. They sign in just as if they were signing into Office 365 or another application. They get the MFA prompt. It actually shows them what's going on. They say okay. That SAML token gets issued to the VPN gateway, and they're signed in. So it's a dramatically better user experience. It's also something that people that manage these devices probably have no idea that it can even do, or even what it is. So it becomes change that sometimes has to be pushed from a different angle. But it's something I would very much encourage, especially if you're trying to do MFA for a device that can do this. Citrix in particular with NetScalers, if you don't have PKI in play, it's really hard to do this federated experience as opposed to Radius because of some of just how it works. But certainly the VPN gateways, it does works pretty well.
Does the NPS extension, is that Azure AD only, or does it work for MFA servers as well?
That's a good question. So does the NPS extension only work with Azure AD, or does it work with MFA server as well? And it is Azure AD only. If you are on the legacy MFA server, today that is going away, but there's not yet a migration path off of it. All right, so with the exception of PIM, everything we've talked about is in the Azure AD P1 variant, but inevitably your Microsoft salesman will be back to the well to see what else they can get from you. There's a capability in Azure AD called identity protection that is part of the P2 stack, and what it gives you access to is every single sign-in that goes through the Azure AD pipeline actually gets risk scored by Microsoft. There's a machine learning pipeline. Everything goes through there. There's a certain number of, they have a threshold for it. It has to happen in a certain number of milliseconds. There's well over 100 tests that happen on that. That risk scores the sign-in. You can now use that risk information for a couple things. One, when we talked about conditional access, deciding the who, what, and when of someone accessing an application, we can factor that risk score in and make a dynamic decision about whether A, the user has access at all, or B, what activities they need to do to actually be able to access that app. The other thing we get is that's the concept of what identity protection calls sign-in risk. We also get the concept of user risk. So we talked about leaked credentials would be one concept of user risk. Someone that has a leaked credential would be rated high in this. There are other tests around things like, are people coming from an anonymous IP, so something like a Tor browser, for example. Are they coming from devices that are showing patterns of being infected with a known piece of malware? There's certain patterns maybe that it uses when it tries to sign in. Impossible travel is another really common one. So I sign in from an IP that Microsoft believes to be in Detroit now. Then 2 hours later, I sign in from an IP address that's believed to be in Beijing. It's highly unlikely that I got myself from Detroit to Beijing in the course of a couple of hours. All those things factor in to the risk score for the user as well. And now we can take actions automatically with identity protection. So their risk score is above a certain level. Maybe it's above medium or it's high. I can force them to reset their password next time they sign in to automatically clear those risk events. My experience with this is that when you turn it on, it can be really frightening what it starts telling you. You may not realize what's going on. You can actually go in the identity protection area in the Azure portal. There's a button you can click. You can turn it on for 30 days, and it will start giving you for that 30-day period all this data about what's going on. I have had several customers that have turned this on for 30 days and then been able to take that report and get the funding to get this just based on the data about what's going on. All right, so last one. So everybody probably has a process for how you provision things on-prem. How does someone get hired? They get an account in AD, they get that Exchange mailbox, they get access to your ERP system, all those different applications. You also probably have this set of SaaS applications that are lacking or have no governance at all, is my experience with a lot of organizations. Because, of course, your on-prem IAM system has no knowledge of those, or maybe it does, but the work to actually make it know about a Salesforce or a ServiceNow, for example, hasn't been done. Azure AD has a concept of outbound provisioning, where it's now about 85 apps that they have connectors for, where not only can you federate with that application and have single sign-on, but you can now map on-prem security groups to those applications, and Azure AD will programmatically connect to that app and provision the user there. It will keep attributes up to date. In certain apps, you can actually map those groups to roles. So Salesforce, for example, it brings all of your Salesforce roles in. Amazon Web Services, it brings all of your AWS roles in. You can map your on-prem security groups, which you probably already have processes for how people get into them, how governance happens for them, and so forth, to those roles. And Azure AD will automatically make sure those people are assigned those roles in those applications, and keep them up to date. And then, of course, when people leave, it can pull those back, or when they change roles, it can pull those people out of those roles. So now you have governance without having to extend necessarily an on-prem IAM system to actually talk directly to those apps. So there's 80 or so apps that have this today. You can also generically connect to anything that does the SCIM standard. There are actually a handful of apps that do that as well. So it's not just some professor's science fair project anymore. But it's another cool thing to check out and be able to bring some governance to. And I think I am just about out of time here. So just to kind of summarize, we talked about self-service password reset. That's, for some organizations, can pay for the investment all by itself. Privileged identity management, getting control over built-in roles, things like global admins, exchange admins, people that have access to a whole lot of data, a whole lot of configuration. Delivering single sign-on not only to cloud apps, but also on-prem apps with the Azure application proxy, and then using conditional access to determine who has access to those apps, when they have that access, and what they have to do to get into it. Password hash sync is super important to have on. You get the leaked credentials reporting, and when you factor in identity protection, you can take automatic actions about what happens to those people if their creds show up on that leaked credentials list. And of course, with Azure AD password protection, we can try and help people choose less awful passwords within the confines of the policies that you have. And then finally, we just talked about outbound provisioning for SaaS applications. And I'm happy to take a few questions, and of course I'll be here the rest of the day as well, and look forward to chatting with everyone. So hopefully this was valuable, and enjoy the rest of the day. Yeah.
Do any of the provisioning, the SaaS provisioning connectors, bring attributes back from the SaaS application into AD?
So the question was, do any of the SaaS provisioning connectors bring attributes back from the app into Azure AD? So today, the only one that does is Workday. And Workday supports a whole inbound flow. Many of them bring roles back in. So the AWS one, for example, the only thing it can do is suck all of your IAM roles out of AWS and bring them into Azure AD.
Okay.
Cool beans. Well, thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of the day.